A racist tourist slaps a black royal guard and he didn't fight back, but what happened next shocked everyone. The slap could be heard over the courtyard cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, stopping the crowd of tourists in their tracks. American tourist Gerald Whitman stood there grinning with his hand still raised from being hit. He was fat, sunburned, and had a camera hanging from his neck. When Marcus Campbell, the royal guard, put on his full formal uniform, he stayed calm, even though his cheek was turning red. Gerald leaned in closer, and his voice was full of snide remarks. "Hey, what's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just another coward hiding behind that silly uniform?" People in the crowd gasped. Some people automatically raised their phones to record every second of the fight. A child clung to his mother's leg and looked back and forth between Marcus and Gerald with wide eyes. The guard, who was known for being very strict, didn't move. He had the symbolic gun by his side in his hands and looked straight ahead as if Gerald didn't exist. But Marcus's silence seemed to make Gerald even more cocky. The tourist felt better after hearing no answer, so he opened his arms wide and faced the people watching. "See? He is helpless." "That's what I thought. Just a dumb figure." The crowd's whispers got louder, and they were now a mix of anger and shock. One woman whispered, "This is disgusting," and grabbed her bag tightly. "He must stop." Through the noise, there was another sound that was deep and strong. "Enough!" A man in an old, worn-out trench coat stepped forward, dividing the crowd. He had neatly combed his gray hair, and his sharp eyes were fixed on Gerald like a hawk on its prey. Just being there seemed to give off an air of power, which calmed down the people who were watching. Gerald's confidence stayed the same, but his smile faded. "Old man, who the hell are you? Another fan of the Queen's little soldiers?" He crossed his arms and sneered. The man looked at Marcus for a moment, but his face was too blurry to read. He then turned around and walked toward Gerald. His voice was quiet but very sharp. "Are you aware of the person you just insulted?" Gerald laughed and brushed off the question. "This guy is dressing up. What does it mean to you?" He shook his head, and there was just the tiniest bit of a smile on his face. He spoke in a low, thoughtful voice. "You've made a terrible mistake, and you won't be able to change it by then." People in the crowd started to talk as Gerald's friends pulled away, realizing that things were getting out of hand. Gerald waved his hand indifferently, still trying to hold on to his fake confidence. "So what? There was nothing wrong with me." He moved forward one more step, and was now only a few inches away from Gerald. His eyes were red from anger and sadness at the same time. "Not yet," he said in a scary voice, "but you will." Marcus finally moved behind the two guys. He slightly changed his stance, but his calm attitude didn't change. He saw the tiniest flash of something, determination or resolve, in his eyes, and it was gone as quickly as it had come. The stress in the crowd was so high that you could cut it with a knife. The older man stood up straight, and his voice broke the thick quiet. He pointed at Marcus and said, "Don't worry about him. That's what comes next." The older man warned Gerald, but Gerald ignored him with a smile. "What's next? A scolding from the Queen herself?" He jeered, which made his friends laugh in a nervous way. "Hey, buddy, I pay your taxes. I'm going to do whatever I damn well please." The older man's jaw got tight, but he didn't say anything. He instead took a step back, giving Gerald another chance to shine. You could feel the stress in the air, and the crowd was moving around uncomfortably, as they didn't know whether to step in or just keep recording. "See?" Gerald barked, and then looked back at Marcus. "Not even your fans are brave enough to defend you. That's so funny." He pointed an accusing finger at Marcus's chest and laughed as he did it. "Those silly steps you're taking make you look like a puppet. I made you interesting, so thank me." Marcus stood still and his face looked like a stone mask. Still, his quiet said more than anything he said. It wasn't surrender, it was control, and the tension around him grew as a result. There were some whispers in the crowd. Some people were criticizing Gerald, and others were mumbling Marcus's name. The older man, who was now looking from the sides, gave a young woman who had been filming the whole thing a subtle look. Gerald moved even closer, not caring that people were getting more angry. It got darker and meaner in his voice. "Do you not think you're better than I am? Standing there like no one can touch you." He poked Marcus in the chest with his finger. "Hey, guess what? You're not." Gerald reached up and hit Marcus on the head with his hand, taking off his tall black bearskin hat. The crowd let out a simultaneous gasp as it fell to the ground. A wave of movement spread through the crowd, and some people took a step forward as if they were ready to step in. Marcus, on the other hand, didn't move. He didn't move, and his eyes stayed straight ahead. "Grab it!" Gerald's barking could be heard all the way across the patio. "Go on! Put down your stupid hat and bow to me at the same time." That's when the older man stepped forward again, drawing instant attention to himself. He gave Gerald a firm hand on the shoulder. That's enough. Gerald turned around and pulled his shoulder free. He growled, "Who the hell do you think you are?" His swagger was now tinged with anger. The older man leaned in and spoke in a low, scary voice. "Someone who is sure of who he is, not like you." His words, which were cool but sharp, made Gerald stop talking for a moment. But before anyone could do anything, someone else came out of the palace door. A big, tall man in a royal guard officer's outfit walked into the scene. His sharp moves and sharp eyes cut through the confusion. The officer, whose name was written on his coat as Colonel Harper, looked at the scene with a mix of disgust and interest. He looked at Marcus for a long time and then moved to Gerald. Gerald shook a little as the colonel looked at him closely. "Just what does this mean?" Harper's voice was loud and authoritative, like someone who wouldn't put up with nonsense. Gerald's bluster faded for a moment, but he quickly got it back. He pointed at Marcus and said, "This guy isn't doing his job. He does nothing but stand there like a wimp while I—" Harper put up his hand to stop him. "Enough," he told Gerald, and his voice cut through his excuses. He looked at Marcus, but his face was blank. He spoke calmly. "Private Campbell, you've shown amazing restraint." The crowd was tense, and their eyes kept moving between the people in this tense scene. Harper then fixed his eyes on Gerald, and his face became more serious. "And you, sir, have shown that you don't know anything." Gerald was about to say something back, but Harper put up his hand again and stopped him. "Do not make excuses. I've seen enough already." Harper's next words were vague and full of meaning. "You spoke badly about a crown soldier. That's a big deal. You'll also learn that what you do has results that you were not expecting." The older man stood on the edge of the crowd and crossed his arms. He looked grimly happy. Gerald, on the other hand, had no idea that a storm was coming. He laughed and walked away. "That's right. Are you going to arrest me?" Harper made a small smile with her lips. "Let's see." Marcus's eyes behind him flashed with the tiniest hint of something that wasn't being said. The crowd's breath stayed steady as the air got thicker, setting the stage for what was bound to happen. As Colonel Harper held Gerald in his sharp gaze, the courtyard was tense to the core. The people in the crowd whispered quietly, and their phones were still recording to catch every detail of the scene as it happened. Gerald, whose face was red with pride, stood his ground, not realizing how serious the situation was. "What are you going to do?" When Gerald said it again, his voice was filled with disdain. "Take me to the Tower of London, please. Everything here is a joke." Harper's cold look didn't change, though. He slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, sleek radio instead. By pressing a button, he spoke in a calm voice. "My name is Colonel Harper. Sergeant Whitmore needs to be in the courtyard right away. Level of importance, urgent." The vague order made people in the room nervous, and Gerald laughed it off. "Oh no, what now? What about a backup for your costume party?" Before Harper could answer, the older man from before stepped forward again, this time with his eyes narrowed on Gerald. "Are you sure you know when to stop?" He said it with a sad tone in his voice. Gerald made a face. "And what are you, his lawyer?" "No," the man said calmly, his face getting tougher. "Just someone who has seen men like you before, loud, cocky, and oblivious to the storm they're walking into." As if on cue, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a plain suit walked out of the side door to the castle. He walked with purpose, and he wore a serious mask over his face. In the noon sun, a unique badge on his belt sparkled, and everyone in the crowd seemed to understand what it meant. For the first time, Gerald's smile broke. The man walked up and gave Colonel Harper a short nod. "I'm here to help you, Sergeant Whitmore." Harper made a hand motion to Gerald. "This is an incident that might need more attention. I'm sure you'll know what to do next." Whitmore fixed his sharp eyes on Gerald and judged him with the accuracy of someone who had seen a lot of things go wrong. He took a step toward Gerald and said, "I understand. Sir, you need to stay here while we figure this out." "What do you sort out?" Gerald barked, and his voice got louder. "I did not do anything wrong. What I did was assault a member of the Royal Guard," Whitmore said in a cool but firm voice. "And based on how you're acting, I bet there's more to this than meets the eye." The crowd was now totally quiet as Whitmore took a tablet out of his pocket. He started to tap the screen, and each second his face got darker. He looked up and asked, "Mr. Whitman, is it?" Gerald's confidence dropped even more. "How do you know my name?" Whitmore didn't answer right away. He turned the tablet around to face Harper instead, who leaned in and gave him a grimace. When the colonel turned his attention back to Gerald, his eyes got darker. "It looks like your pride has caught up with you." "Do you mean to say that?" Gerald asked, his forehead getting wet with sweat. Whitmore took a step forward and lowered his voice just that enough to sound dangerous. "Let me help you out with this. It looks like this isn't your first time getting in trouble with the law. You're already in trouble for what you did here today. Your name was linked to several reports of disorderly behavior, vandalism, and abuse made around the world. The color of Gerald's face changed. That has nothing to do with this. Harper cut through Gerald's protest with his voice. It has everything to do with this. What you did today is just the latest example of how careless and selfish you are. But now you've done something wrong that can't be fixed with money. As Gerald stuttered, the older guy in the trench coat laughed in a mean way. You thought no one could hurt you, right? Thought no one would ever make you do something. Shut up! Gerald lost it and his voice broke. You don't know anything about me. The older man took a step closer and his face stayed the same. He said, I know enough. And you are about to learn that no matter who you are, what you do has results. Marcus stayed as still and quiet as ever when Whitmore turned to look at him. Private Campbell, your calmness today says a lot. Most people would have behaved differently if they had been provoked in this way. Marcus gave a soft nod and kept his eyes on her. When Whitmore turned back to Gerald, his voice became more serious. Mr. Whitman, I have one more question for you. Are you ready to work with me? Do you want to make things harder for yourself? The question hung in the air, and Gerald's eyes kept jumping between Whitmore, Harper, and Marcus, who wouldn't give in. His confidence was fading, and he couldn't get away the way he usually did. Before he could answer, the sharp sound of a police siren could be heard far away. It got louder as the seconds went by. More whispers could be heard as the crowd moved around uncomfortably. When Gerald saw that the sound was coming straight for him, his face got a little whiter. The sharp sound of the oncoming siren cut through the tense silence in the courtyard. As the bright blue lights of a police car came into view and wound its way through the crowd, Gerald Whitman's stubborn stance started to break. As the car skidded to a stop near the palace gates, two policemen stepped out with intent, but it was impossible to read their faces. What the hell is this? Gerald spat and his voice shook with fear and anger. Are you going to call the police on me? Why? A slap? This is crazy. Colonel Harper stepped forward, creating a long shade over the tourist who was getting more and more agitated. He spoke in a cold voice, Mr. Whitman, this is no longer about your so-called harmless prank. You hit a member of the Royal Guard and messed with royal property. It turns out that Interpol has already marked you for other crimes. This event isn't happening by itself. When the police officers came up, it made what Harper said more important. One of them, a tall woman who seemed calm, but in charge, spoke to Harper. Colonel, we've been told. Is this the man in question? Harper gave a short nod. That's him. Gerald's confidence was like a dying flame. Wait a minute. He stuttered, putting up his hands to protect himself. Everything here is a mistake. I had no idea. I didn't mean what I said. The old man in the trench coat shook his head and Gerald could barely hear him because of his loud voice. I don't know what. Not aware that he was a royal guard, or didn't know that what you did has effects. Gerald looked at the man with a desperate look on his face. You don't get it. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was only a joke. The female cop took a step forward and spoke calmly. Mr. Whitman, it was a joke that went viral around the world. You should know that these issues are very important to the crown. Even more so now that video of what you did is going around the internet. Gerald went cold. Footage? While he looked at the crowd, his voice cracked and his eyes moved quickly from one raised phone to the next. Get rid of it. That can't be posted. Oh, this is private. But the crowd didn't move. They looked anywhere from disgusted to quietly happy. A younger man on the phone raised an eyebrow. He told her straight out, oh, it's already live. Guy, you're famous all over the world. Gerald felt the weight of the news like a wave running over him. As he tried to get back in control, his chest shook, and his eyes went crazy with fear. Don't hurt me like this. I'm going to sue all of you. Enough! Marcus Campbell's bass got loud enough to be heard over the noise. After the fight started, the quiet guard spoke for the first time. The crowd shook when he spoke in a cool but authoritative way. Gerald even stopped ranting and looked blank. Marcus stepped forward and his huge frame broke through the tense atmosphere. Gerald was stuck in place by his fixed, sharp gaze. He asked, Do you want to talk about what's fair? His voice was calm but very tense. Let's talk about being fair. The guard's sudden words made Gerald trip and fall backward. You don't talk to me that way. Marcus didn't pay attention to him. He was very focused. For hours, I've stood here to protect this place, putting up with your insults, attacks, and haughtiness. It wasn't that I couldn't answer, but that I chose not to. I was strong, not weak, she said. The people in the crowd agreed, and with each word, their respect for Marcus grew. Marcus moved forward one more time and is now only a few inches away from Gerald. You believe that your power gives you the right to treat people however you choose. You learned today, though, that the world doesn't spin around you. Marcus's eyes made Gerald shrink, and the weight of what he said crushed what little resolve he still had. He looked at the police officers and spoke in a panicked way. Are you going to really put me in jail for this? I have rights. I am an American citizen. The female police officer looked at her partner and then back at Gerald. Mr. Whitman, you are now subject to British law. And from what you did today, I think you've lost any pity you might have had. When she gave her partner a nod, he stepped forward with handcuffs ready. You are being arrested for assault, public disorder, and damage to sovereign property, Gerald Whitman. You are allowed to keep quiet. As the cuffs went around Gerald's wrists, his face turned red with fear. No, it's not possible. This will make you sad. Everyone. Still, the police led him to the waiting patrol car, and he didn't say a word. As the crowd split up, their phones continued to record every second of Gerald's public humiliation. The courtyard was very quiet as the car door slammed shut behind him. Marcus, who had returned to his spot and was as calm as ever, caught everyone's attention. The older guy in the trench coat moved closer and gave a quiet nod of approval. He said in a soft voice, "Well done, soldier. Some fights are won without doing anything." Even though the crowd started to spread out, there was still a lot of stress in the air because of what had just happened. Marcus didn't move and kept his eyes straight ahead. He was a live example of how important it is to be respectful and calm. As the police car carrying Gerald Whitman drove off down the street, there was a strange silence in the courtyard. Marcus Campbell stood at attention, but no one could read his face. Those who had just seen him stay calm in the face of danger thought his calmness was almost magical. Colonel Harper stepped forward. The look on his face was a mix of respect and something deeper that the crowd couldn't quite make out. With his arms crossed and a knowing look on his face, the older guy in the trench coat stayed put. He wasn't just another person watching. His actions and quiet power made it seem like he was important, but no one could put their finger on who he was. Harper looked over at Marcus. His speech had an official tone as he said, "Private Campbell, do you want to file a formal complaint against Mr. Whitman for what he did today?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He instead slowly bent down and picked up his traditional bearskin hat from the ground. He cleaned it up and put it back on his head carefully. He didn't speak until then. His speech was quiet but strong. "No, sir, this is not something that I think will be needed." Many people in the crowd were shocked. After everything he had been through, why wouldn't he want justice? Harper gave me a funny look and nodded. "That's fine, even though people will notice how calm you are today." A taller man walked up to Marcus and kept his eyes on him. He asked, "It's not just restraint, is it?" The whispers in the crowd were drowned out by his strong voice. "You knew this was going to happen, right?" The question hung in the air for a long time. Marcus's eyes moved a little to meet the man's. For the first time there was a slight nod of agreement, a quiet sign that there was more going on. He turned to Harper and spoke in a firm voice. "Colonel, they need to know who he really is." The crowd stopped moving because they were so interested. Harper paused and looked uneasy before he let out a sigh of resignation. "All right." He took a step back and waved Marcus to come forward. Still calm, the guard now had the full attention of everyone there. Harper spoke to the crowd and said, "You see, Private Campbell is not just a member of the Royal Guard. Besides that, he is a decorated warrior who served as a hero in some of the world's most risky war zones." People in the crowd let out gasps, but Harper wasn't done yet. More importantly, he is one of the Crown's most trusted secret agents, chosen because of his extreme skill, discipline, and honesty. The news came as a thunderclap to the crowd. The man they had just seen Gerald Whitman put down was not at all what he seemed to be. "That's why he didn't react today," the older man said. He did not have to, because a man like Marcus Campbell doesn't behave like a fool like Whitman does. His quiet wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a plan. People in the crowd started to mutter, some in shock and others in shock. Marcus finally spoke, but he was still standing at attention. Discipline is what makes a soldier different from a tyrant. It's simple to act angry, but strong to control your anger. The older man gave a nod of approval. "Well said, soldier." A young woman in the crowd spoke up. Her voice was shaking, but she would not back down. "Thank you, Soldier Campbell, for everything." Others agreed with what she said, and the crowd started to cheer. The moment wasn't over yet, though. Harper put up his hand to calm the crowd down, and his words became more serious. "You should know one more thing about Private Campbell." Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Marcus. "Should I tell them, or would you like to—" Marcus stopped and looked at all of the faces in front of him. After a moment of quiet respect, he spoke. "Everyone knows about it now, sir. It's okay with me if you do." Harper said yes. Private Campbell is more than just a soldier or agent. He also comes from a family tree that includes one of the first black people to serve in the British Navy. This family history goes back more than 200 years. He and his family have served this country with honor, even when it didn't honor them back. The crowd went quiet again, but this time they were shocked and moved. It felt like history was hanging in the air, which made what they had just seen even more important. The older guy took a step toward Marcus and spoke in a soft but strong voice. Son, today wasn't just about you. It was meant to show Whitman and everyone else what real honor looks like. As the crowd broke up, Marcus went back to his place. The people around him were talking about a mix of respect and self-reflection. Even though the courtyard was quiet again, what had happened had an effect that could be felt far beyond the palace walls. As the sun went down, it cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace. The crowd had split up, but their whispers of awe and respect could still be heard far away. There was less noise in the room now, but the air was heavy from what had just happened. Marcus Campbell stayed at his post, his back straight and his eyes set straight ahead. People walking by thought he was as stiff and unmoving as ever, but inside he was thinking about what had happened that day. When he thought of Gerald Whitman, his pride and lack of knowledge were clear to see. Marcus had met men like him before. They thought that loud noise and fear gave them power, and they thought that quiet meant weakness. Gerald found out today that it wasn't true. Colonel Harper walked up and stopped a few steps away, his boots clicking against the stone. He looked at Marcus for a moment, and his face showed a mix of respect and quiet admiration. Harper told Campbell, "You did a great job with yourself. Very few people could have dealt with that and kept their cool like you did." Marcus slightly turned his head to show that he understood the praise. "Thank you, sir." It wasn't just about staying calm, though. It had to do with principle. Harper said yes, and that idea has spread far beyond this courtyard. The video of what took place has already gone around the world. People are learning what real power looks like by seeing how calm and respectful you are. The old man in the trench coat joined them with his pockets tucked in. His earlier sternness had changed into something more thoughtful. "Marcus," he said in a low but strong voice, "today you showed everyone something they needed to see. That dignity isn't just how we act when things are going well, but also when things are hard." Marcus barely smiled as he thought about what to say. "My grandfather taught me that. The strongest man isn't the one who fights every battle. The strongest man is the one who knows which battles are worth fighting," he told me one time. The older man gave a nod of approval. "Wise words, and you've shown them to be right today." Harper moved toward her and lowered his voice. "You've not only protected the honor of the guards, but also of every soldier and person who has ever had to suffer injustice in silence, waiting for the right time to speak out." The quiet between them was full of understanding that they didn't say out loud. He looked back at the royal gates with a humble face. "Sir, I wasn't just standing up for myself. I spoke up for people who don't have a voice or a chance to speak up at all." Harper stood up straight, and his face showed pride. "Then you've done more today than any of us thought possible." He gave Marcus one last nod and pulled his coat closer around him to keep warm in the cool evening air. "This day will be remembered by everyone, Marcus. Not because of what that jerk did, but because of how you dealt with it." Marcus went back to his place as the two men turned to leave. The silence covered him like a second uniform. As the sun went down, it turned the courtyard of the castle a soft orange color. In the days that followed, video of the event went viral, starting talks all over the world on social media, in the news, and at dinner tables. Gerald Whitman's name became linked to haughtiness, lack of knowledge, and the bad things that happen when people don't check their own sense of privilege. But more than that, Marcus Campbell became a sign of strength in the face of adversity. He was a man who stood tall, both physically and mentally. Love and support came in from all over the world. Marcus was praised as a hero by veterans, activists, and regular people alike. He was seen as a live example of bravery and respect when things went wrong. People who had never met him but saw themselves in his problems asked him to talk at events, praised him, and thanked him in letters. But Marcus stayed the same. Every morning he put on his suit, went to work, and stood there the same way he always had, with quiet pride and a strong sense of purpose. The lesson of the story was clear. Real strength isn't loud or cocky. It's quiet, determined, and controlled. It comes from being able to rise above and be honest when it's hard to do so. It also encourages other people to do the same. Marcus stood outside in the courtyard as the sun came up. His shape cast a long shade over the area. And at that moment, he wasn't just a royal guard. He was a reminder to everyone that deeds, even ones that are meant to be quiet, say louder than words.
A fat Karen tried to attack a veteran in front of the royal guards, but she never expected this. A loud, shrill voice cut through the air. The fat Karen yelled, "Hey, you! Yeah, I'm talking to you." She shoved past people, forcing her way to the front, her face twisted in frustration. The royal guard in front of her didn't move. He stood, stone-faced, silent, gripping his rifle. Karen's lip curled in outrage. She stepped even closer, her voice rising with entitlement. "Oh, so you're just going to stand there and ignore me?" she shouted directly at the soldier. A few people in the crowd chuckled. Others raised their phones. This was about to get messy. Then Karen stepped over the security barrier. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She wasn't supposed to do that. A security officer immediately took notice. "Ma'am, step back right now," he called out. Karen snapped her head toward him. "Don't tell me what to do," she snapped. She waved him off like he was nothing. Then she turned her fury back to the royal guard, jabbing a finger toward his face. "I paid thousands of dollars to be here," she screeched. "The least you can do is take a picture with me. What, you think you're better than us?" The soldier remained still. Karen's face turned red. She took another step forward, almost chest to chest with the guard. "I'm talking to you, you little brat!" she barked, her voice shrill and shaking with rage. Then another voice spoke, deep, steady, and firm. "Step back, lady. You don't know what you're doing." Karen spun around. A man in his 80s stood nearby. His posture was strong, his eyes sharp with experience. He wasn't just any bystander, he was a veteran. Karen's eyes narrowed. "And who do you think you are?" she sneered. The veteran stared at her unfazed. Karen huffed, crossing her arms. "Mind your own business, old man," she spat. "Nobody cares about you." The crowd murmured in shock. The veteran didn't flinch. Karen's hands balled into fists. Then, without thinking, she raised her hand. The crowd gasped. She was about to do something she would instantly regret. But how did it get to this point? Let's go back just a few minutes earlier. The fat Karen had already been fuming before she even got close to the royal guard. She had been pacing near the crowd, loudly complaining to anyone who would listen. "This is ridiculous," she huffed. "We came all this way, and these lazy guards won't even talk?" A group of teenagers standing nearby snickered, recording her meltdown. "They just stand there all day, doing nothing," Karen scoffed. "How is that even a real job?" Her husband, a quiet man with an exhausted look, stood a few steps away, clearly too embarrassed to get involved. Then Karen's eyes landed on one particular guard. A young soldier, tall, stoic, gripping his rifle with perfect discipline. Karen grinned wickedly. "Oh, I'm going to make this one crack," she muttered under her breath. She marched straight toward him, shoving through the crowd. A security officer, standing nearby, noticed immediately, raising a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, please stay behind the barrier." Karen ignored him. She was locked in on her target now. She stepped past the barrier, breaking one of the biggest rules at Buckingham Palace. A few tourists gasped, whispering nervously. That's when the veteran noticed her. Standing off to the side, the 80-year-old military veteran had been quietly observing everything. His sharp eyes narrowed. He had seen this type of entitlement before. He shook his head. "She's about to make a big mistake." And he was right, because in just a few seconds Karen was going to do something she would never be able to take back. Karen had already crossed the line, but she was just getting started. The fat Karen stomped right up to the royal guard, practically breathing down his neck. She glared up at him, her eyes burning with frustration. "Hello? Can you even hear me?" she yelled. The soldier didn't blink. His grip on the rifle remained firm. His face was unshaken. Karen's nostrils flared. "You think you're so tough, huh?" she snapped. "Standing there like some kind of big shot, ignoring people?" She stepped even closer. Her face was inches from his. The crowd muttered nervously. People held their phones up, filming every second. A security officer rushed forward again, his voice more serious now. "Ma'am, I'm warning you. Step back immediately." Karen spun toward him, her face twisted with rage. "Or what?" she screamed. "What are you going to do? Arrest me for talking?" The veteran's voice cut through the air once more. "It's not just talking, lady," he said firmly. "You're disrespecting a soldier." Karen's head snapped toward him. She let out a cruel laugh. "A soldier? Please! These guys are just standing here like statues. This isn't the army. It's a joke." A few people in the crowd gasped. Even the security officer's expression darkened. The veteran took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on Karen. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said calmly. Karen crossed her arms, smirking. "Oh, yeah?" she sneered. "And what would you know, old man?" The veteran held his ground. "Because I served," he said simply. "Unlike you, I know what it means to stand for something." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, boo-hoo," she mocked. "Let me guess. You want a medal? You think that makes you special?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered in shock. Karen's voice got louder. "Why should I care about some old man who fought in some war 100 years ago?" she scoffed. The veteran's expression didn't change, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The security officer moved closer. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Step back, now." But Karen was too far gone. She turned back to the Royal Guard, eyes full of spite. And then she did something no one expected. She lifted her hand and shoved the veteran. The crowd gasped so loudly it was almost deafening. A collective shockwave rippled through the people watching. The Royal Guard shifted. For the first time, he moved. Karen's smirk faltered. She realized too late. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen had just done the unthinkable. She shoved an 80-year-old veteran, and now she was about to face the consequences. The crowd stood frozen in shock. Gasps echoed through the air. People stared in disbelief, their phones held high, capturing every second. The Royal Guard shifted again, his rifle adjusted slightly. Karen's smirk faded. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. "Oh, what? What are you all looking at?" she snapped, her voice suddenly unsure. The veteran staggered slightly from the push, but he didn't fall. Instead, he stood his ground, his piercing eyes locked onto Karen. The security officer rushed forward, his hand on his radio. "Ma'am, that was assault," he barked. "You are in serious trouble." Karen threw her hands up, laughing nervously. "Oh, please, I barely touched him," she scoffed. The veteran straightened up. "That barely was enough," he said coldly. The air was thick with tension. The Royal Guard suddenly took a step forward. His massive black boot hit the pavement with a loud stomp. Karen jumped, her face drained of colour. The crowd erupted in whispers. This was serious. The Royal Guards never move unless absolutely necessary. But this time, the soldier had taken a step, and he wasn't finished. The soldier lifted his rifle slightly, angling it toward Karen. It wasn't an attack, it was a warning. But to Karen, it felt like the walls were closing in. Her breath hitched. She took an instinctive step backward. "Hey, I was just joking," she stammered. The Royal Guard's face remained cold, unshaken. Karen swallowed hard. The security officer grabbed his radio. "We need additional personnel at the front gates. We have a disturbance, possible detainment required." Karen whirled around. "Detention? For what?" she shrieked. She pointed aggressively at the veteran. "He started it. He got in my face first." The crowd erupted in boos. People shouted back. "You shoved a veteran," someone yelled. "Shame on you," another voice called. Karen's face burned red. Her head darted around, desperate for an escape. But there was no way out. The security officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, I suggest you cooperate." Karen let out a shaky laugh. Oh, come on. You're not really going to arrest me over this, right?" she pleaded. The veteran tilted his head slightly. "Actions have consequences," he said simply. Karen whipped back toward the Royal Guard. "You're just gonna let this happen," she screamed. "Say something." The soldier remained silent. Karen gritted her teeth. Her hands balled into fists. She was about to snap again, but then something happened that shut her down instantly. A high-ranking officer emerged from the gates. His polished uniform, sharp eyes, and commanding presence sent a wave of dread through Karen. He walked with purpose, and he was coming straight toward her. Karen froze. For the first time, she realized just how bad this was. Her knees wobbled. The officer stopped just a few feet away. He gave a sharp nod to the Royal Guard, an unspoken command. The soldier stepped back into place, returning to his original stance. The officer then turned his attention to Karen. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. You have violated the rules of this establishment. You have harassed our soldiers, and you have assaulted a military veteran. Karen's lip trembled. The officer's expression remained ice cold. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was completely speechless, and for the first time, she looked truly, utterly terrified. Karen thought she could get away with it, but she was dead wrong, and now she was about to face the full consequences of her actions. Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could get away with shoving an 80-year-old veteran and mocking the Royal Guard, but now she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Karen stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. The high-ranking officer's piercing eyes never left her. The crowd was silent now. Everyone was waiting. The officer took a single step forward. "You have violated the sacred rules of Buckingham Palace," he said firmly. Karen's chest rose and fell quickly. Her confidence? Gone. Her voice shook as she stammered. I didn't know." The officer didn't flinch. "Ignorance is not an excuse," he said coldly. Karen's hands trembled. She whipped toward her husband. "Honey, say something," she cried. Her husband looked at the ground. He wouldn't even meet her eyes. Karen's breath hitched. She spun back to the officer. "Please, it was just a little push," she pleaded. The veteran shook his head. "A little push," he repeated. His voice was calm, but behind it was years of discipline, strength, and dignity. "I fought for my country," the veteran said. "I lost brothers in battle, and you just put your hands on me because you didn't get what you wanted." Karen's lip quivered. The officer raised a hand towards security. "Remove her." Karen's eyes widened. Wait, what?" she shrieked. Two security officers grabbed her arms. Karen started thrashing. "No, you can't do this. I'm a paying tourist." The officer didn't even blink. "And now you're a paying tourist who just got banned." The crowd erupted in applause. Karen kicked her legs wildly. "You can't ban me," she screamed. "I'll sue." The security officers didn't stop. They dragged her toward the gates. Karen's face was beet red. She screeched at the top of her lungs. "This isn't fair! You can't do this to me!" As she was dragged away, the veteran let out a quiet breath. The Royal Guard never moved again. He was back to standing perfectly still. The high-ranking officer turned to the veteran. He gave a small, respectful nod. The veteran returned it. No words were needed. The crowd broke into cheers. People clapped for the veteran. A group of teenagers high-fived each other. And Karen was gone. But her humiliation would live on. Forever. Because thousands of phones had just recorded everything. And the internet? It never forgets. But just when everyone thought it was over, something happened that no one expected. Karen had been dragged away in shame. The crowd cheered. The veteran stood tall. The Royal Guard never broke his composure. But just when everyone thought it was over, something unexpected happened. The security officers disappeared behind the gates, taking Karen with them. People in the crowd began murmuring. "Did she really just get banned?" someone whispered. "Serves her right," another person chuckled. But then a new whisper spread through the crowd. Someone pointed toward the palace gates. "Wait, is she getting arrested?" A man in a sharp black uniform had just stepped out from a security post, a higher-ranking officer. He spoke briefly to the guards. Then one of the officers nodded and reached for his handcuffs. The crowd erupted in shock. "No way!" someone gasped. "Is she actually going to jail for this?" The veteran watched in silence. A small smirk crossed his lips. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, like he knew justice was finally being served.